Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 4th of October 1924, the Labour Party has a bigger communism problem, another big communism problem, and a smaller corruption problem. South Africa has a race problem, Britain doesn't have an asylum problem, and the opinion polls are wrong. But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. There is ominous news from the coal mining industry. A lot of pits look like they will have to close. Cheap imports from Germany are being blamed. The price of bread is up again, see the 27th of July episode, from 9.5 pence to 10 pence for a £4 loaf. In the Red Shadow, a play by J.E. Cairns on the political situation in Ireland, has been banned by the Lord Chamberlain. As I've said before, if there was a golden age of free speech, this wasn't it. The ability of the Lord Chamberlain to ban plays won't be abolished until the late 1960s. The Lord Chamberlain, by the way, is the most senior member of the royal household. No, really. As for Cairns, I haven't been able to find a thing about him, despite the fact that he had written plays and had them performed before. Adolf Hitler will have to wait a little longer for his release from prison. Apparently he is mixed up with something called the New Front League, which violates his parole conditions. The Times had an article on the Rif War in Morocco. It would appear that part of Spain's problem is its reliance on tiny isolated outposts at the top of mountains without access to a secure water supply. By the way, at about this time one Francisco Franco was trying to organise a coup, not that you'd know this from reading the Times. Max Waechter, who died this week, is not a name that is well known today. I came across him when he took out a full-page ad in the Times in January 1914, in which he said this: "Peace is proving more costly than war. Before long the nations may endeavour to find relief either in a great war compared with which the Balkan War was merely child's play, or the people may revolt in despair and overturn their governments, or national bankruptcy may become general in Europe. Or all three." His solution was to create a federal Europe, although one does wonder how that would be constituted, given that some governments were republican and others monarchical. There's a blackmail case going on. John Bull magazine was a highly successful publication of the time, run for a long time by Horatio Bottomley. Bottomley was something of a character, and is currently in jail for fraud. Anyway, one of his money-making schemes was to approach a potential advertiser and, should the advertiser decline to buy space in his magazine, threaten to write an uncomplimentary article. It would appear that Bottomley's replacement is carrying on the tradition. A Viennese doctor has claimed to have performed the world's first eye transplant. He hasn't. A series of articles and letters on the conditions in the Soviet Union tells us that everyone has to join a union, union bosses are appointed by the Communist Party, and that Soviet industry is falling apart. The Times has an obituary section. I swear it never used to. A man has been sentenced to prison for 3 months with hard labour for letting a flat he didn't possess. There have been murmurings in the labour movement about a capital levy, or a wealth tax. Given that they went into the 1922 election with this policy, and it didn't go down well, you would have thought they would have learnt their lesson. There have been a number of letters on the subject of noise. Traffic is a big problem. Drivers seem to be very horn-happy. Many lorries are fitted with solid tyres that make nearby buildings vibrate. There are also street musicians. They may seem harmless, but in some cases they engage in extortion. Give us money or we'll keep playing. I now know why busking was banned. The London Traffic Act has come into force. This will, in the course of time, lead to a monopoly in bus transport in the capital. There is a proposal for a motorboat service along the Thames. It always sounds like such a good idea. London streets are crowded, the river is almost empty, let's move people on boats. And it never works. See the 24th of February episode. In another piece of traffic-related news, there was this. Sentence of 4 months imprisonment in the 2nd Division was passed at the Middlesex Sessions yesterday on Charles Edward James Bowstred, 32, chauffeur, who was found guilty of wantonly and furiously driving a motor car and causing bodily harm to Jesse Pateman. It was stated for the prosecution that on the night of September the 5th, the defendant was in charge of a car containing 6 other persons at Wood Green. The speed was estimated by the police and other witnesses to be between 50 and 60 miles an hour. On turning the bend in the road near Knowle Park Railway Station, which no longer exists, the car mounted the footway, knocking down 6 iron posts, and then crashed into the railway bridge. The woman Pateman was the only person in the car injured. The police alleged that the defendant was drunk. And in the United States, there are accusations that the New York Giants baseball team has been attempting to fix games. If you are wondering why you've never heard of this team, other than having no interest in baseball that is because they moved to San Francisco in the 1950s. Talking of America, the US presidential election is hotting up. An article in the Times claimed that the independent candidate, Robert La Follette, was doing well. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. But it did have this to say. The Hearst newspapers, for example, have been taking polls of voters in 15 cities in which they are published. The polls are not taken among readers of these papers, else the results might be regarded as expressive of the views of one political stratum only, but in the main they have been obtained by polling audiences in theatres, workmen coming out of factories, or travellers passing through railroad stations or ferry houses. The last figures published put La Follette in the lead, Coolidge closely approaching him in the number of votes, and Davis, he's the Democrat candidate, lagging in the rear with less than half the number of votes of either of the other two. Well, I suppose political polls had to start somewhere. These days, when someone claims asylum, it can take years to deal with their claim. In the 1920s, things were different. Asked by the magistrate, Mr. Cairns, I presume a different Mr. Cairns from the one earlier, at the Thames Police Court on Saturday why he should not be sent back to Russia, a Russian, unmarried, charged with failing to register with the police, said he would be shot if he was sent back. Asked why, he said because he served as an officer in Kerensky's army and fought against the Bolshevists. He was sentenced to 21 days imprisonment and recommended for deportation. The attitude would appear that we would prefer to keep the country British, even if that means some people ending up in the Gulag. Perhaps our Russian should have gone to South Africa. Or maybe not. In South Africa, they, or at least the white part of they, are very keen to keep the place white or white-ruled. This may prove difficult. White population of South Africa. Danger of disappearing. The report of the Census Director, which has just been issued, is an ominous document from the standpoint of white survival in South Africa. Mr. Cousins' conclusion, he's the director, is that the European race can only hold its own numerically in South Africa by seeking accessions from abroad. Failing this, it must forever abandon the prospect of maintaining a white civilization, except as a proportionately diminishing minority in face of an increasing and ultimately overwhelming majority. It may then be forced to abandon its domination or even abandon the country. It may accept the solution of degeneracy. You are kidding. By perpetuating a Euro-African hybrid European and African civilization. That may seem outrageous, but it is backed up by the science of the time. Government being guided by dodgy science. Couldn't happen today. The alternative is for the whites to take timely measures to ensure that in population the progression of the whites shall not be left behind by accepting the obligation to provide here a home for the surplus of population of Europe. The application of these home truths is obvious, since both nationalists and Labour, which compose the present government, have set rigid faces for years against any comprehensive scheme for bringing in immigrants from abroad. Catalonia in Spain also has its masters, and they're not the Catalans. There is much bad blood between Catalonia and Madrid. Catalonia complains that it is exploited and drained to pay for the unprofitable campaigns in Morocco. The Catalan clamours for complete autonomy. The proud Castilian insists that Catalonia is an integral part of the kingdom and declines to admit that it should be treated differently from any other part. And absolutely nothing has changed since. Parliament was recalled this week, in theory to consider the Irish Bill, which gives the government the power to appoint a representative of the Northern Ireland government to the Boundary Commission in the event, the most likely event, that the Northern Irish government refuses to do so itself. The bill is fairly uncontroversial. The Boundary Commission will determine where the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State should be. The recall of Parliament has been the occasion of a great deal of discontent. The main bone of contention is the treaty with the Soviet Union, which includes a guaranteed loan. The Liberal Party has proposed a vote of censure on this issue. Everyone understands that should the government lose the vote, it will have to hold a general election. Meanwhile, the Workers' Weekly case is coming to a head. I briefly mentioned this in the 7th of September episode. This was the case where the newspaper called on soldiers to disobey orders. That is a pretty clear case of sedition, and the government initiated a prosecution, and then, in a highly unusual move, withdrew the prosecution. After several weeks it issued an explanation. The Times takes up the story. The reasons given in the House of Commons by the Attorney General for the withdrawal of the charges against the editor of the Workers' Weekly were that Campbell, the editor, was not in the regular employment of the newspaper in question, but had merely engaged for a short time to take the place of the editor, who was away ill, that Campbell's responsibility appeared to be very limited, he had not himself written or composed the article, but had merely inserted what was apparently an extract cut from some other publication, that Campbell could in no way be proved responsible for the policy of the paper, which was controlled by a body called the Political Bureau, of which, so far as was known, Campbell was not a member, and with which he was not connected. The current issue of the Workers' Weekly contains an editorial article replying to these statements. It says, "The article on which the charge was based was not copied out of another publication. It was an article written on the specification of the editor for a special anti-war number of our paper. It was not a wild and irresponsible statement inserted in the paper by a young and inexperienced editor. It was a cold, deliberate statement of the party position inserted by the editor, Comrade Campbell, who is a responsible member of the political bureau of the party." Clearly they haven't shortened it to Politburo yet. "Naturally, Campbell did not hanker after a martyr's crown. It is the business of a communist to keep out of capitalist prisons so long as there is no sacrifice of principle involved in him doing so." The great thing about covering events from 100 years ago is that no one is going to sue you for libel, so we can afford to speculate. The government allowed its communist sympathies to override its duty to administer the law impartially. Two-tier Keir, Hardy's successors. And there's the business of Ramsay MacDonald, Prime Minister, and his car. The peculiar sensitiveness of the ministerialists to any reference to Russia or Russian affairs was responsible for angry scenes today. The treatment of persons visiting the British legation in Moscow, I don't know what this is about, the situation in Georgia, see the 21st of September episode, the omission of any mention of the king from the so-called treaties, as they were described by Sir Leslie Scott to the annoyance of Lieutenant Commander Kenworthy, and the suggested interchange of students and teachers between this country and Russia, were subjects which the Labour men desired to remain taboo. It was Sir Kingsley Wood who was responsible for the greatest outburst. He had placed a question on the paper as to whether the Prime Minister proposed to ask the House to make any increase in the salary now paid in respect of the office of First Lord of the Treasury. In case you didn't know, the Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. J.R. Clines, the Lord Privy Seal, who incidentally this week talked about Winston Churchill's class hate, said no. "May I ask," said Sir Kingsley Wood, "whether before that decision was arrived at, consideration was given to the fact that the present holder of the office has found the emoluments of his office insufficient and has to go to a private citizen?" Then the storm broke. Angry and excited Labour men shook their fists and indignantly called for order. Some of them shouted, "Dirty!" I should point out at this point that the Prime Minister's salary is some £5,000 a year, which would have bought you 1,000 ounces of gold in those days. Anyway, just in case you thought uproar in the House of Commons was a new thing. Anyway, that's all for this week. At this point, I believe I'm supposed to say something about liking and subscribing, if you're logged in, that is. In the meantime, I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.